Had the privilege a few weeks ago to travel with my youngest daughter with the Liberty University women's basketball team. She had been invited and she had the option of inviting someone to join her on a trip to Israel. And so that was a privilege. She called me one day when I was on my way to work and she said, "Would you like to go to Israel?" And I said, "Give me some time to think about it." And seriously, I'd never had a desire to travel to Israel. But I have traveled with my youngest daughter. We've been to Africa. We've been to Great Britain. We've been to the U.S. Open 2 times in New York City. We've been to Wimbledon in England as well. And we've always had a good time traveling together. So I said yes. And when I got back, some of our folks go, "When are you going to report on your trip?" And my response was, I wasn't planning on that. I wanted to just kind of work in some of the things when I'm preaching, especially on miracles and parables. But I decided, okay, we're going to try to do that. I want to teach you something, though, this morning. I told you last week, I want something that you can take away. How many of you speak Hebrew? All right. Israel, the native tongue, of course, is Hebrew. And our guide was an interesting guy. He was a guy by the name of Ido, I-D-O. And in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 1, he is the grandfather of Zechariah, this Ido. And so he wanted us to know that he had a biblical name. And he taught us something. Now, there is a common greeting that is well received in all of Israel. And anybody know what that might be? Shalom, right? It can be hello, that can be goodbye, that can be hey, shalom, right? Just one of those things. I never had an occasion to use it while I was there, but because most of the people we were with spoke English. But I want to teach you this morning on how to say good morning in Hebrew, okay? Now, Hebrew reads from right to left, as many of the ancient languages do. We in America are used to reading from left to right. So the Hebrew, the words are this: Boka, B-O-K-A, Tov, T-O-V. And Boka means morning, and Tov means good. And so when you say good morning, you read from right to left. You start with Tov, Boka. For English, though, we would start Boka, Tov. So help me out here. We'll try it one time. Boka, Tov, together. Boka, Tov. All right, you're good. All right, you can impress somebody today with your knowledge of Hebrew. And every time we get on the bus in the morning, the guide would say, just shake his head, and everybody would say Boka Tov. So good morning. There were 4 things I wanted to share with you concerning Israel and expectations. The exceeding amount of Israel is desert. There are just a lot of desert in Israel. There is a great effort on the part of Israel to make Israel the land of milk and honey. They have a problem, however, and we'll see some of the slides, that there's a lot of huge rocks on the terrain in Israel. And in order to make the property available for growing crops, the rocks have to be collected and moved out of the way. Irrigation and planting is priority. You go out through the desert, it'd be like out here on your way to San Diego, and you would see a grove, a large grove of date palms. And it's all irrigated, and they grow those, and it's and also melons. You'll see one of the slides. At every meal in Israel, they served watermelon, seedless watermelon. I don't like watermelon, but I like the watermelon in Israel. And you could have it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and that was a kind of an interesting thing. We also got to know something about the Jewish people. The Jewish people are a proud and elitist group of people. This is my take. We came to an overview of Jerusalem, and we get out. We want to take some pictures. You've seen the Holy Mount with the golden dome, and we could see that off in the distance. We're taking pictures, and a young Jewish family comes walking across. And the guy looks at me and he goes, Americans, welcome to Jerusalem. And the guide was not too far away. He said, don't get used to that. A lot of the Jewish people don't care for Americans at all. And you'll see a little bit about that as well. The Jewish, especially the Orthodox Jewish people, they're the ones that wear the black and so forth, are very inconsiderate to other people. When you're there, it's about them. When in public, it's about them. They have the right of way. The greatest business in all of Israel is tourism. Every site has souvenirs available for the tourist. Hundreds of tour buses move through Israel, the city, nonstop in Jerusalem. I took 1 minute, and we're driving up a freeway, a 4-lane, and I counted 13 tour buses in 1 minute going the other way, so you can see. While we were there, Gaza was launching rockets into Israel. And if you looked on the TV, Israel has something called the Iron Dome. And the rockets would show them take off, and within 5 seconds, they'd explode. And so they didn't have any that were coming in actually into Israel. However, we were in the old city for 3 days before we came home. And that following Sunday, a tour bus was shot, AK-47. 10 people were shot, couple serious condition, and that was the area that we found ourselves in. It's a very volatile area as well. Some of the nicest people I met in Israel were Christian Palestinians. There are a number of Palestinians that are believers, and we'll show you some of that as well. They were kind, courteous, and gracious towards us. Much of Israel is an archaeological dig. I will show you some of the pictures. The land that Jesus walked is well under the topsoil, now covering those areas. The different sites do their best to grab your attention, but you are never truly sure that what you're seeing is what they're describing. And we'll show you some of that as well. We met at Liberty University. We took a 3-hour bus ride to Dulles. We got on a plane, and 11 hours later, we were in Tel Aviv. And as soon as we got to Tel Aviv, we got on a bus and went to North Galilee, another 3-hour bus ride. So as you can imagine, traveling wears you out. So let's put our first slide up. The next morning, this was our first view of the Sea of Galilee from the hotel in Tiberias. And that's kind of like cool, to actually see the Sea of Galilee. Next. This is my daughter Erin and I, and there's a better picture of the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, there we go. The other guy's not my daughter. So anyway, but one of the things that's interesting here, and I got to make sure I've got the right slide here. The Sea of Galilee is about 6 miles wide, and at its length, about 14 miles long. It's not a large body of water. And most anywhere on the shore, you can see the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so there's some interesting aspects of that when you're talking about Bible stories, parables, miracles that we will discuss as we go through that. Next. This is Edo. Edo's an interesting guy. We are right here at the West Wall, which is the Wailing Wall. He's Jewish. There was a guy who is the head of the tour that we took that Edo used to do tours for him first starting out, and Edo was Jewish. And the man that hired him to lead the tour, he was witnessing to Edo, and Edo told him, he said, as long as you leave the Christianity stuff out, we'll get along fine. And about 4 years later, they were back, and Edo was sharing at one of the sites and says, we believers. And this guy went like this, and he had come to faith, which was terrific. He was a military guy as well, all right? This is a small, it doesn't look like a large. You see the side of the plant there. This is a small communion cup made out of olive wood. We did the Lord's table near the garden tomb, and I brought that cup back to give to Sandy Opplinger because she's in charge of our Lord's table here. But that was a nice little keepsake. The first day we traveled to the site Capernaum, and they advertised it as the city or the town of Jesus. We go through, keep going. Here we go. I should have had the clicker here. This is ruins in the area of Capernaum. Like I said, much of Israel is an archaeological dig. And this is a building in Capernaum next. These are some of the pillars that you find that they've dug out, and they've got them on display. Some of them are bases, some of them are caps, but those are a lot of the things that we saw next. This is a church in Capernaum. In many of the sites, which some are called holy sites, there are churches, most of which are Catholic churches. They established their presence there as well. And the next picture, this is a synagogue in Capernaum. It was not open. We took this picture from just outside, but very elaborate and built, and something that's still functional today. Next. The holy sites, these are some of the girls that were a part of the tour. And they would come, and the guide would go to the Word of God and share things with them that were a part of that. And if they were in a holy site, they would cover their heads because that was required. Guys would not wear shorts, would wear pants. We didn't have to cover our heads. Go ahead. And this is Coach Green with Liberty University's women's basketball. He's the one that gave the invitation. This is Katie Finstra, one of the assistant coaches there, as we're listening to the account. And you see the little ear deal. These are called whispers. You ever use one of those? If you've been on a tour, the guide has a microphone, and you can hear through a little earpiece that you have, so he doesn't have to try to shout, okay? A lot of artwork. This is a bronze of Jesus. You can see the holes in the feet and so forth, and he's wrapped in this shroud. No explanation really given for it, but just a lot of things that you pass by. And this is still in Capernaum, okay? All right. Yesterday I got to go with Jim and Dale Miller to breakfast, and we were talking about the fishing boats back in Peter's day. Well, this is a museum, and I want to make sure I get the right date here. In 1986, there were some men that were trying to find artifacts around the Sea of Galilee, and they came across a piece of a board that was sticking up, and the piece of the board ended up being a fishing boat that had been encapsulated by the mud along the Sea of Galilee. And so they began an archaeological dig once again, and they began to dig this out, and it was in very fragile condition. And I was telling Jim that I thought probably about 15 feet long. And in reality, this boat was 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. And so they went to work digging this out, and it was so fragile that they needed to move it from where it had been found. And so they actually had to encapsulate this boat, not in styrofoam, but in fiberglass. And when they do that, it was just a huge, almost a block of fiberglass, and they moved this to another location, ultimately to the museum. And this would have been a boat much like Peter's fishing boat. And as we were learning about the boat, I found this out, that when the fishermen used their boats in the New Testament time, the time of Jesus, they would put a pretty amount of water in the base of the boat. And when they caught fish, they put them in that water while they were fishing. And so when we see the great draught of fishes and so forth, when the nets are coming over into the boat and there's concern that we may sink, right? Well, that's what was taking place as well. So we have the boat here. All right, next. All right, this is an interesting photo. You can only imagine how far this goes, how high, wide this is. Israel does not allow ownership of private property as far as land is concerned. The government owns all the land, and they lease it to farmers like $1 for 99 years, right? They're not trying to hold on to it. They just don't want it being sold. In that situation, you find the Muslims, the Arabs, and so forth. Don't want that being sold. And farmers farm the land. Now, there was a farmer that was farming. He had a field that covered everything that you see, right? And he had a Massey Ferguson tractor, and he would plow. Well, the Massey Ferguson broke down, and so he bought a John Deere. And the John Deere was more powerful, so he could drop the plow down another 6 inches. And when he did, he hit the top of a column. All right, he gets out, he sees it, and he's under law to report. He's come across a historic site. And this was the historic site. It was a complete Roman colony north of the Sea of Galilee. It had a stadium, it had a theater, it has all these pillars and all these things. And it was just an interesting, and our guide as well had been an archaeologist and had shared a lot of that with us. Keep going. Sea of Galilee, see one side, you look across, you can see the other. Very green, very lush around the sea. Next. Now, you move away from the sea, and this is the land I was telling you about. This actually had been burned, but you see the rocks and so forth that have to be taken care of and moved. It doesn't look like a land of milk and honey for sure. Next. We had the opportunity to baptize in the Jordan River. And there was another young man, Stephen Thomas, who was on staff at Thomas Road Baptist Church, and myself, who were ministers. And so this was the women's basketball team, right? And I'm about 6'3". This girl right here is about 6'7", right? And so when it came time, we didn't have handkerchiefs to grab her nose, right? I had to reach up and grab her nose, take her down, and so forth. The next day, we're at lunch, and she's got a little nose ring right here. And I'm sitting there across from her and my daughter, and her name is Bella. I said, Bella, that was a unique experience yesterday. She goes, I know, it was wonderful to be baptized in the Jordan. I said, I've never baptized in a river before. And I've never baptized a girl with a nose ring, right? And my daughter across from me goes, Dad? And I said, no. I said, I didn't want to hurt her. I don't know how those things are connected, right? So anyway, it was good. We did okay. Next. This Coach Green, baptized him there as well in the Jordan. These people know the Lord. They've been baptized before, but this was an opportunity. Next, this was the group that was a part of the baptism as well. And for those of you that are new, the girl on the end, the two girls in the back, Bella, who's about 6'7", the girl next to her is 6'9". And I baptized her as well. So that was interesting. All right, next. Now, as I said, I had no desire to go to the Holy Land. And I asked Erin as we were approaching the Jordan, I said, are you going to get baptized? She goes, no, I've been baptized. I baptized her here when she was 7 years old. And she said, I'm fine. And so as I was baptizing others, I saw people lining up, and one of the people lining up was Erin, all right? And so what a bucket list thing for your family, right? To have the opportunity to baptize my daughter, and what a great picture. And that was a great opportunity. Next. Now we are coming up on the area of the Sermon on the Mount. And as I said, there are churches that have been built at all these sites. And this is a church. And this particular church, Catholic church, is housed and run by nuns of the Catholic Church. And so as we come up next, here's a little sign. A lot of these around as well. Let anyone who thirsts come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture says, rivers of living water flow from within him. And so you have sayings. We'll come across these next. This is a picture or an inlay of Jesus teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Next. Once again, a picture of the church. Okay. A lot of little things that are put together. This is fishes and commemorative of the loaves and the fishes as well, feeding of the 5,000. Next. This area is the closest and best picture. You see the Sea of Galilee, and that brown area is actually covering for crops that are underneath it. But there is a large field there. And they claim that's where the Sermon on the Mount took place, right? Now, as I was listening to our guide, I never asked the question, but I always wondered, maybe you've wondered as well, how could Christ teach 5,000 people without any amplification, with any kind of God is God. He could cause everybody to hear what he was saying. But the guide said this. He said, there's a place here in this field where if you stand to speak, everybody in the area can hear what you say. And that was kind of an interesting thing. Never asked the question, but that was something that took place. Next. Edo once again directing us around, and this is actually a slide in Capernaum. Very knowledgeable. Been doing this for a long time. Next. We were there with the women's basketball, and they were going to do a couple of clinics. And this particular clinic was going to be done with Palestinians. And so we all had a part in being a part. And obviously there's a language barrier sometimes. So this girl is interpreting for Coach Green. The guy that he was familiar with there is the one that runs the facility. And they were going to do a clinic there. Next. This is one of the girls, Caroline. And you can see she's bent down, and these little girls. It was interesting to watch. These little girls looked at these college basketball players as heroes, right? And they were totally mesmerized by them. Next. This little guy got into it as well, and I think he's got a job for him there to get a shot off with the girl guarding him. It was good, and the girls from Liberty are enjoying this as well. Next. This was after we finished. We were invited to a facility there near where the gymnasium was, and they had a dinner laid out for everybody who came. They were hospitable. They gave everyone gifts and so forth. And this is the Palestinian folks. And I got to tell you, I've got an idea of who Palestinians are, and this wasn't it, right? So it caused me to think. Those of you that know me over the years, there used to be a Swenson's over here at Metro Center. It's one of my favorite restaurants to go to. And over time, it was handed down, and the last people that owned it were Palestinians from Bethlehem, right? And I got to know them, and they knew Christ as their Savior. And I'm pretty sure these people as well knew Jesus as their Savior, which was great, all right? My little granddaughter, Emmy, made some rubber band bracelets. She's first grader. And she sent some with us to give to whoever we thought we should give it to while we were in Israel. And this is one of the little Palestinian girls. And if you can't see it there, around her wrist is a little rubber band bracelet that Emmy had given. So I wanted to make sure that she knew that was given out. Okay? All right. Nothing in Israel is flat. Everything is either uphill or downhill. And what goes down must go up. And we're on a tour. This tour is actually in Megiddo. Anybody here know the importance of Megiddo? It's where what? I'm sorry? It's where the Battle of Armageddon is to be fought. And this is a area that there's water down below, and the tour guide I'm standing up. I took a picture and I thought, no, I'm not going down there, because if you go down, you got to come back up. And you figure that it's about 95 degrees as well. It's hot in Israel while we were there. So I waved goodbye and I went to the little shop and waited for them to come back. Little did I know there was an outlet down below where the bus picked them up, right? So they had to come looking for me, but they found me. I made it back as well. But there was a lot of things like this. You can imagine the work that went in to putting this together. Next. Now this was a point of interest. Qumran. Qumran was a village where Essene monks copied scripture, all right? And it was the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Next. It was a little village. It had all kinds of aspects. It was very self-contained. It was in the desert, obviously. Keep going, next. Here is a picture of the terrain that these people are in. I went to, right when I got back, I went to lunch with Steve Evers and Gary Howe, and I said, guys, I got to tell you something that I learned while I was in Israel. And they're like, wow, good, he's going to share something. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found near the Dead Sea. And like you, they went, oh, right, that was it. All right, next. This is one of the caves where the scrolls were hidden by the Essene monks. By the way, there are those that believe that John the Baptizer was a part of this village at one time before he made his way to baptizing in the Jordan, all right? And in order to get into that cave, you see the openings above? That's how they had to get into the cave to find the different, I got to get my deal here together, to find the different scrolls and so forth. Next. We went to a museum on the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was very informative. And this is a container. There was a young goat herder that was in this area, and he was herding goats, and one of the goats, he disappeared. He could hear him, but he couldn't see him. And the goat had slipped into one of these things and fallen into one of the caves. And so the young man took a rock and he threw it down there to see if he could get a response from the goat. Instead, he hit a container like this, and it shattered. So he went the next day, got his brother. They came back with ropes. They went down and they found a number of containers containing scrolls. Not really aware of what it was, but the people in Israel are very good about reporting finds like that. And this particular container is over 2,000 years old. It's not a replica. It's the real thing, and it was worthy of taking a picture. Next. At the museum as well, somebody took the time to do a scale model of the city of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. Next. Right here you see a picture or a scale model of what the temple on the Holy Mount would have looked like. And it was intriguing. You could walk all the way around it, and just a couple of pictures there. Next. Dead Sea, all right? I got this deep into the Dead Sea. I stepped in, and actually it was farther because there's a crust on the bottom of it, and you drop about another 3 or 4 inches. It's hot around there. It's arid desert. The water is hot. Some of the people wanted to get in. You look back here, the guy right there floating, couple of them, they're sitting, basically in the sitting position. Our guide had a good comment. He said, no one has drowned in the Dead Sea ever, right? Because you can't go under the water. They warned you about splashing the water. You don't want to get it into your eyes and so forth. It can be very stinging, all right? How many of you have heard of Masada, right? Well, this is a picture from the tour bus of Masada And it was one of the areas, one of the things that I really was interested in and I wanted to know more about. Next. All right. Up on Masada, this area, we take a picture down. Herod had built or had a palace built on Masada. All right. And it was a place where he could retreat to in case his enemies, which Herod had Jewish enemies, and he could retreat to and have a safe place. It could be easily defended and so forth. So he had a palace here. He never, ever went there, never saw it. But he had everything you could possibly want. He had food, he had water, he had all the things that are necessary to feed a lot of people for over a year, right? All right, next. The Romans, Masada was a place I want to write down here for sure and make sure I tell you correctly. Masada was the last holdout against the Romans. Remember in 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. There was a rebellion on the part of the Jews against Israel, and this was the last holdout. And Masada means fortress. And so they came to this place, and in 73 to 74 AD, the Romans were going to squelch this holdout, but they had a problem. The Jews had the high ground. And they had the ability to throw rocks and all kinds of things. So the Romans began to build a ramp over a long period of time. You can imagine all the soil and so forth that had to be put in place. And this continuing battle kept taking place. And the time was at hand that the rebels realized they could not hold out against the Romans. And so the rabbi called all the men, leaders of the families, they had a synagogue there as well, a Masada. And he said, we're not going to be able to win this battle. It's just a matter of time. And so we have to make a decision. It is better to live and die free than to become slaves. And so next picture. These are pieces of pottery that have been sharpened. And on each of these pieces of pottery, there's a family name. And so the men together, they decided that it was better to die free than to be slaves. And so what would happen? A person's piece would be drawn. The man would go to his home. He would take and slice his children's neck, his wife, and he came back. And this went on. And the count is somewhere between 960 to 1,000 people. And when the Romans finally broke through the barricade, they were expecting a battle like none other, but there wasn't. There were only 2 widows and 3 children that remained. Everybody else was dead. It was really something that was amazing, and you actually have a sense of quiet resolve as you look at those and imagine what it was like for a father to do something like that. And then the men did that as well, and finally the rabbi took his own life. But that was the holdout against. And a couple things in regard to this. Edo shared with us that he was military. And he said, we were military. It's the comparable type of service as we would have our elite troops. And he said, as you would have Navy SEALs, that's kind of what we were like on that level. And he said, our initiation finally was to climb Masada. And when we climbed Masada, there was a flag in the middle with a Israeli flag flowing from it, or a flagpole with a flag. And they would come, and their leader would be there, and they would make a half circle. And then they would kneel, and their leader would give them an Israeli flag, and this is interesting, and a Bible. Said it is your job to defend both. I thought that was a really powerful thing as well. And so this aspect of Masada, the next thing was this. The rabbi, when he gathered the men, read out of the book of Ezekiel, the valley of dry bones. How that the Lord, when he comes, is going to bring Israel back to life into a mighty army. Well, here's the problem. I was talking with the other young fellow, the pastor from Thomas Road, and this was after the time of Jesus, who was the Messiah. They had rejected the Messiah, and they looked at this believing that somehow God would resurrect them back as his people. But they died without Christ. They died believing they were still waiting on the Messiah when the Messiah had come and gone. So those people aren't in heaven. I'm amazed at their bravery and their resolve, but that doesn't, sincerity doesn't bring you into a relationship with Christ. Next, we finally came to Jerusalem and took some pictures. I'll be saying something about what you see at the bottom here in just a moment. But this is the Rock of the Dome. It's a Muslim mosque. It's where the temple will one day be rebuilt. Tradition says it is the place where Abraham offered Isaac as well, and we'll say more about that in just a moment. But it's not nearly as big as you see in the movies, right? They make it look huge, and it's not. All right, next. Got to have a camel ride, right? Not me, all right? But interesting. Some of the girls went on a camel ride. Next. There, once again, the dome. You can see some of the olive trees. We're going to be saying more about that next. The Mount of Olives, right? Important in our understanding of the sacrifice of Christ. He spent much time at the Mount of Olives. Before he was taken for the crucifixion, he prayed Gethsemane there in the Mount of Olives. You'll see that it's fenced off. The reason, let me look at the next picture. There's a picture of Christ at the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, next. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. It's the words of Christ as he knelt there and sweat, as it were, great drops of blood, asking God to let the cup pass, the cup of his wrath. All right, next. Here again, we've got the church on the right-hand side, which is the Catholic Church, and you've got the olive trees there on the left. They've fenced it off because tourists would break off branches of the olive trees to take with them as souvenirs. So they had to do that. This is the Damascus Gate of the city of Jerusalem. It is a thoroughfare of business. There's shops on each side as you walk through. Next. This little frame, lit frame, gives you a small section that they believe, by the way, there's no verification for this, but they believe that that pavement was pavement that Jesus actually walked on his way to the cross. So they've highlighted that. We have no idea whether that's true or not. Next. Now we're coming near the garden tomb. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life, John 11:25. Next. All right, this is an interesting photo. First of all, this is a bus station right next to these holy sites, right? And the guide told us that what you see there on the hillside is Golgotha, right? That's Golgotha, and I'm kind of like, okay. And they said you can see the skull. You have to know me. I'm kind of like, right, trying to figure out, how that is. But If that is Golgotha, which they claim that it is, it's a very important site. Let me tell you why. It's also a part of the range of mountains that the Rock of the Dome is on. And when Abraham was commanded of God to take Isaac and offer him as a sacrifice, they made their journey towards what we now know as Jerusalem. And it says, and Abraham could see the place afar off. Dr. Adrian Rogers had a great message on this, and he said, Abraham saw Golgotha. And it was the site that God had commanded Isaac to be sacrificed on. So when they go to that site, on that place, where we know later would be the site where Jesus would die on the cross, Isaac, they build the altar. They have the wood that Isaac carried, and Isaac is on the altar, and Abraham is ready to do as God commands. Because, if you read the account, he knew that God had brought Isaac forth out of deadness, and he could raise him from the dead, but Abraham was going to complete the commandment. And so as he takes the knife, what does God say? Stop. Stop. And Adrian Rogers says this, the reason God said stop is your son's not going to die on that place. My son is, for the sins of the whole world. And that's a powerful thought, right? And there's a lot of power in that. Next photo. Aaron and I there again. This was an entryway. Everything is a site, right? And you have to buy tickets to get in to see the garden tomb. Next. Walkway down, you see the opening there, which would have been the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Next. We're coming at it from a different perspective here, cut into the rock. A lot of the rock there is limestone, and so it's cut out, and that's a burial chamber. Next. Okay, you come in, and we're standing right here as part of the tomb, and that area there is where the bodies would be laid once they were prepared, where we were standing there. And that is blocked off. And so they claim that this is the tomb that Jesus was in and resurrected from, and so forth. Now, there is another place also in Israel called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a Catholic church and a holy site. And they claim that they have the tomb of Christ. We did not go there. Those that we were dealing with said this is the tomb of Jesus, the garden tomb. Next. Now, when we looked at the dome on the rock, we're standing at the Mount of Olives, basically looking towards the Dome of the Rock, and this is a cemetery, and these are actually gravestones. They look like actual places where bodies would be, but they're actually above the ground. People are buried about 4 feet under that. And in this location right here, there's approximately 1 million Jewish people buried here. And they're waiting for the coming of Messiah. But Messiah has already come, right? If you look over against the wall there, you'll see more of these, and those are Muslim, right? They're buried there along, and I don't know their theological implications of what they're doing. Next. A lot of people have asked me, what was your favorite thing? And it's not a favorite thing, but it was a powerful thing. This is a mosaic on what's now referred to as the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest in Jerusalem. When Christ was arrested, he was brought before Caiaphas. And this is a picture of Caiaphas questioning Jesus, and these two men are beating on Jesus, right? They're pounding on him as Caiaphas is questioning him. Now, I sat down across from that, and I just kind of contemplated. It's one thing to be the subject of a beating like that and be powerless to change it. It's quite another thing to be the king of the universe, right? And what held back his response to them was his love for us, that we might have a relationship with his Father. And it was just powerful, right? Next. As you walk up to this isn't Caiaphas' house. It's been rebuilt. But here's a little memorial. It shows Peter. The girl here is accusing Peter of being one of them. And he says, I know not the man, right? And on top, there's a rooster crowing. As you walk up to Caiaphas' house, guess what you hear? Roosters crowing, right? And there are chickens in the area. But I guarantee you, the people that do the tourism thing are up to whatever they need to do to get your attention. But that was something interesting as well. Next. Now, this was in the actual foundation. This has been built, this outer one. But down there is part of the actual foundation of Caiaphas' house, and underneath is a dungeon. Now, why would the high priest need a dungeon, right, in his home? Well, as you look at that, there's about a 14 to 15 foot drop. If you were going to be put into the dungeon, they would drop you in. And somebody asked the guide, said, wouldn't that hurt the person being dropped into the dungeon? He says, well, the 2 foot of human waste on the bottom would help break the fall. And then they would take a stone and cover that, and you would be in pitch black isolation in the dungeon. I just kind of brought it home when you see that actual dungeon. Next. Watermelon, right? This is Bella, my friend, right? And we love the watermelon. Next. Tilapia with the heads on. You see the guy right there? That's Will. You could see his appetite just peaking there, right? Like, wow. Every meal there was rice. A lot of times we had chicken, different things. The food was good, but after a while it all began to taste the same. Next. This is Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, you don't see any Orthodox Jews in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a very modern city, probably liken it to South Beach, Miami. You walk across the promenade there and so forth. Next. This is Aaron, our bus driver, drove our tour bus. We stopped at a place, and this is a T-shirt he's holding up. He said, "Don't worry, America." That's an F-16. Israel is behind you. That means in Israel, we got your back, right? Now, it's supposed to be what? The other way around. We're supposed to have Israel's back, but this guy's making a statement. Next. All right, we're going to show, if you just bring it up without turning that on yet, Barb, I want to explain this. This is while we were near the West Wall, and one of the things that takes place, when a young man turns 13 in Judaism, he has a bar mitzvah. And the bar mitzvah is a time when he comes to the temple and he reads from the scripture and he becomes his own entity before God. Before that, he's not responsible to keep the commands and do all those things. That's his father's responsibility. But when he turns 13, then he becomes the man. There is also one for girls called bat mitzvah, and they do the same thing. Bar mitzvah began to kind of take place. It was seen even a little in the 2nd century, but in the Middle Ages, it became a prominent part of Judaism. And I taped this little video segment to show you what it's like. There are bands at the entrance waiting for somebody to show up, and they go in with them. There are balloons, there are all kinds of things, so go ahead. You'll see the young man here in just a minute. Right there, clapping his hands, the yarmulke. line of relatives coming with them. That's good. My conclusion would be this. If you go visit Israel and you don't have a relationship with Christ in your heart, you won't find Jesus in Israel. You find a lot of biblical, historical settings set forth by people who don't believe in Jesus, for one thing, for the most part. But if you have Christ in your heart, there are a number of places where you can contemplate that this was a place. For some reason, Israel is very important to God, right? It's where Jesus is coming back to, right? And because of that, but when you understand the people of Israel, Jewish people in Israel believe that American Christians are naive because American Christians want to celebrate Jewish customs. And they don't know why you would want to do that. Israel, for the most part, as a nation, is not, obviously not Christian, right? And in their own turmoil. But this aspect of Israel is important to God. And one day, and I always told people this, they went, you want to go to the Holy Land? I said, no, I'll visit it when during the millennial kingdom. Be a lot safer back then, right? But it was an interesting experience. And I think most of all for me, as I'm looking at doing the miracles and doing the parables, it kind of brings it to life for me. And we don't normally do this, but 2 or 3 minutes. Any questions? I may have an answer, I may not. Any question you might have? Yes.
I was curious about that picture with the boat that they found or whatever. What is that greenish bluish stuff that it's sitting in? Is that some sort of a mineral or is that limestone or something, or is that just
You know, I don't know. I'd have to look back and see what it is. I don't know that there's any preservative there that they've got it housed in, but the wood itself is preserved. Anybody else? Question at all? How many of you been to Israel? Wow, right? How many of you'd like to go to Israel? Okay, sign up in the back. We'll do a tour. No. And we can do it for $5,000 a person. We can do that. And you can have watermelon, right? And enjoy. All right. I certainly appreciate you being here today. I hope that was of interest to you. As I said, I hate trying to put things together like that, but maybe you saw something that God touched your heart with, and I appreciate that.